It's a pleasure to be here. I think the library did a great job putting on things like this too. So got to give kudos to the grand poobah of the Temple of Knowledge here. All right. Hopefully my technology works. All right. Walt Whitman in 1882 kind of made what he thought was prophetic, but I think is really captures the epitome of what we're going to be talking about here today. He said, quote, "Future years will never know the seething hell in the black infernal background of countless minor scenes and interiors. Not the official surface of the courtness of the generals, not the few great battles of the Secession War. And it is best that they should not. The real war will never get in the books. Its interior history will not only never be written, its practicality, minutiae of deeds and passions will never even be suggested. The actual soldier of 1862 to 65, north and south, with all his ways, his incredible dauntlessness, habits, practices, tastes, language, his fierce friendship, his appetite, rankness, his superb strength and animality, his lawless gait and 100 unnamed lights and shades of camp, I say, will never be written, and perhaps must not and should not." I don't think that I agree in any way, shape, or form with that last sentence. I think it should be told, and I think it is being told right now. What we're talking about is the social history of the Civil War soldier. Now, some people, when I say social history, glass over, checking out right there. Some of my students, not interested at all. Especially when I do American military history. In American military history, so many students are so shocked by what the class is actually about. Because what do they want? They want me to go up to the dry erase board. They want me to show troop movements. They want to see flanking maneuvers. They want to see the fishhook-shaped interior lines at Gettysburg, troops moving back and forth, little round top, and then, lo and behold, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain does a backflip over, down the hill, over the 15th Alabama and saves the day at Gettysburg. They want to see that. When I get to World War II, they want to see tanks blowing up and Luftwaffe planes dropping bombs. They want to see atomic explosions with the grand finale. But military history really isn't that anymore. Military history started to turn to where we are looking at the social lives of the soldiers and the influence that those had on people. And largely what it is that we're looking at how we experience war. And there are many different ways to go with it. In this summer, I was fortunate enough to take my kids to Gettysburg. And when you go to Gettysburg today, you can experience war in any number of different ways. Actually, we hit Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, and Antietam all within about a week because we're so close to each other. Would have hit Chancellorsville, but we got stuck in traffic. But you can do so much. And when I was there, I kind of had this epiphany. And so you get to see slides in my summer vacation. My kids sitting on the little round top, right where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in his heroic struggle, although he was part of a much grander operation that included Pennsylvania and New York troops, but nonetheless it's there. And they're experiencing the war themselves. And out of the woods, there's always a docent that comes in out of the woods and gives you some interesting details right when you least expect it, kind of spooky on one level. But you get to experience the war on the site. And my kids absolutely loved it. Here there, I thought I'd ever put a picture of my daughter. My oldest is assuring me he's not shooting her, even though but he's sitting right where the 69th Pennsylvania met Pickett's charge as they came across. But oh no, that's even better. No, we had to walk Pickett's charge twice, I might add. We walked it twice. And they loved it. They were experiencing it. And it struck me as we were walking across that they were experiencing actually more social history on one level when all of a sudden they decided to die. And then they'd get up and walk and then die again. On one level, they were trying to do social history. They were trying to experience combat in the way as best they could using their wonderful imaginations what life was like walking across that field. Of course, they also had me poking in their ears. Oh, now we're in grape shot range. They're going to open the canister cannons on us. Oh, now the muskets are coming. Oh, so I kind of do that. Boom, explosion, and they die on cue. After I started catching on like the game, This is what we're looking at today. It's not so much the big troop movements, it's what it's like to be on the ground, lying there, wounded, perhaps for a day or more, amongst other wounded soldiers and dead soldiers as pigs are coming in and the only thing you got is your gun to club them away. Those kinds of things. How we experience the Civil War is today very, very sanitized, obviously. And so what we want to do as historians, and what we've started to do, is to look at history in a different way. The last one here I think is great, even for death. I forgot that I had this picture up here. Even in death, my son, which you saw from Jim Lynn's, Dr. Lynn's lecture, undoubtedly, because you have to have it. I think it's by law you had to have this in your PowerPoint, right? Had to even go in there, he had to put himself in there exactly where it was. You know, I mean, trying to experience it on so many different levels. But that's what we call new military history. New military history is focused on entirely different sets of questions, entirely different sets of presentations, and reaching very different conclusions. Old military history is what we sometimes now call operational military history, although there are some historians now that say, oh yes, old operational history isn't even history anymore. That's military science, because at the end of the day, Pickett still loses when he goes across the field, right? And Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain still runs down. The charge up the hill at Fredericksburg still ends in futile disaster. What can we learn from that? That's already been written. That's what happened, not what does it tell us. I'm not so sure I'm going to go that far with it, but it is different. It is different. What we have is the old one asked entirely different questions. It looked mostly at politicians and generals. What were the decision-making processes? Why did they choose who they choose to do what they did, and how did they do it? Troop movements, both on a grand strategic level across entire theaters, but even in battlefields. Look at battles. Battles, of course, which is exactly what some of my students always want in the military history class we teach here. And it's not that there isn't battles in my class, don't get me wrong, there's still the whiff of gunpowder. But nonetheless, the focus is not on a battle a day, like you could do if you really wanted to. But the questions that are asked are really where the heart and soul is different. What did they do it? What did they do and why did they do it? How did this help secure victory or defeat? What were the problems of command? What made an effective commander? These are the kinds of things that operational history looks at. New military history, on the other hand, asks entirely different sets of questions and looks at entirely different data sets. New history looks at soldiers. Now, soldiers can be officers, and they can include generals on some level, but for the most part, you want to look at the rank and file. You want to look at the people who are doing the marching, who are doing the fighting, who are sitting around in camp 99% of the time. You want to see what their experience was and how they experienced the war. And I very purposely say the war, because the war does not just include combat. The war includes the whole experience. And the questions are entirely different. Who served? Who's in the unit? Why did they serve? I mean, it seems self-evident on some levels, but these are good questions. What did they think? How did they behave? Because not all of them behaved all that honorably, but some of them became more honorable as the war progressed. How did combat affect them? How did they conceptualize what victory and defeat was? That's an interesting one, because in old operational, well, we know how it ended, we know who wins the battles. Well, how did the soldiers conceptualize what is victory and defeat? How did they experience war both in and out of battle? And what roles did gender and racial constructs play? In other words, they are a reflection of their society. And too often in the operational model, we have separated military, both soldiers as well as behaviors, separate from society, when in reality that isn't true. Now, one problem that Civil War historians face is that there is so much out there. There is so much primary source data out there. There's government records, there's personal memoirs, there's regimental histories, there's letters. They wrote copious amounts of letters, which are great for us on the level. There's so much out there. But on the other hand, that lends itself to this new military history very effectively. And my problem is that when I started putting this together, I wanted to talk about every one of those questions up there. So I hope you packed a lunch and a sleeping bag, because we're going to be here until January. So I had to have it pared down. It was hard kind of paring it down, because all of these are fascinating questions. But we're going to kind of focus on a couple different things here as we go. Now first, the evolution of this new history. I'm going to give you kind of the historiographical part of it. This is the stuffy professor part here. But it's also going to be your reading list, all right? Instead of saving and handing out a reading list at the end or giving you some suggestions, I'm going to kind of integrate it. And I'm going to put it in here now to kind of show you what we're talking about, to kind of preview, foreshadow what's coming. Right after the Civil War, our primary sources already started to explode. They started collecting various records of the government, and they've got them published up, and the library has a complete set of them, by the way, both north and south, of the official battle reports and things like that. But then regimental history started coming forth, as did personal memoirs. This was a period of time when everybody was very supportive and feeling very proud about their service, both north and south. And so there's all these types of things that are out there. Now, these regimental histories and these personal memoirs really kind of clouded what you would expect to find, because it really was more on the regimentals, the old operational model, movements, that yes, there's some, this is how I experience combat, but it's still clouded by the patriotism. The people who took the time to write their memoirs, in fact, were extraordinarily patriotic and proud of their service, and rightfully so, don't get me wrong. But that also affects what they put down on paper. It wasn't until many, many years later that many people found these huge caches in their family histories of letters that went back and forth between the letters, and they kept them. And those now have been published on a fairly significant level and made available in any number of archives as well. But those are really what are the best ones. But these first ones give a certain picture that historians then begin to write about, and later on, a new generation of historians. It wasn't until Mel Wiley wrote his book in the early 1950s called The Life of Billy Yank and the Life of Johnny Reb that we moved beyond the troop movements, regiments moving in unison, and battles and things like that. It was really, he took a new approach. What was life like? He's probably single-handedly responsible for really kind of starting the reenactor movement, because if you go to any reenactor thing, there's always a little place where they sell books. His books are all over the place. I mean, they're over 50 years old, but they're still very popular. You go to any Civil War battlefield, I've been to a lot of them. These books are always on the bookshelf, still in print. He looked at it, but he didn't really look in an analytical sense. He didn't try to answer any questions other than what was life like, and he tried to answer it. He does have questions that he does answer without necessarily meaning to sometimes, particularly in terms of motivations for going to service. But that was really, really it. Then we went back to kind of the fighting drum history, the troop movements, until the 1960s. The 1960s changed quite a bit in the field of history in general, but especially military history, pointed by Vietnam and then also the Civil Rights Movement. It became very clear with both of these that the individual players within a grander movement actually have a unique and fundamentally different perspective than the whole. Yes, the March on Selma, the sit-in, we can take a look at it, and sometimes we miss it with the crowd. We miss getting in and seeing what their individual motivations are to get on the bus and right through the South. Or what their experience was in Vietnam. And Vietnam also changed things because it brought the experience of the soldier nightly into your living room in live color motion with television. And it was a tremendous upheaval on one level, and people had a different mindset. And this affected, consequently, the historical profession and how they then turned towards history. And the new military history started to, which had all those questions I told you a minute ago, started to come about. The most influential is John Keegan. John Keegan wrote a book called The Face of Battle, which has nothing to do with the Civil War, but it fundamentally changed military history. It was a very strong academic work that looked at World War I soldiers, and it looked at them without necessarily looking and answering the operational history of the troop movements of battle. What was their experience? How did they conceptualize what they were doing? How did they conceptualize victory and defeat? He looked at a wide array of data, including poetry and letters, in ways that other historians hadn't when they looked at World War I. And it changed everything. It kicked open the door for Civil War historians who had such a rich data set from both sides that was also in English. So that helped too, because you got to know other language if you're going to study something like World War I. And so it kicked open the door to a whole number of different books that came out.